I woke up before the alarm, as I have for many years now. It sits on the nightstand more out of habit than necessity. The body knows when it's time to open its eyes. The room was quiet, truly quiet, the way it only gets in the early morning when the night is already tired and the day hasn't yet decided to enter. I lay and stared at the ceiling, white, with a barely noticeable crack near the chandelier. I've known it for a long time. Sometimes I think it appeared with me, or maybe it's simply aging next to me, the way everyone who lives in one place ages. Breaking was a little heavier than usual, but not from pain. From thoughts. They always come first, before movement, before sounds. I thought about how they were leaving today. Again. The word rest sounds beautiful, almost festive, but behind it there's always something unsaid. When they said it on the phone, their voices were light and quick, as if they were afraid to linger on the line for an extra second. Mom, we decided to get away for a bit. You understand, right? I understood. I always understood. Understanding became my second skin. I slowly turned on my side, listening to the house. It breathed with me. An old house always knows its inhabitants, knows when they wake up, when they're sad, when they're trying not to think. I carefully lowered my feet to the floor, waited for my body to agree with the movement, and only then stood up. The floor was cold, but I didn't rush to put on my slippers. The chill seemed to remind me that I was still here, that it was truly morning. The kitchen smelled of yesterday's tea. I put the kettle on, sat at the table, and folded my hands in my lap. Once upon a time, at this time, I'd get the kids ready for school, then my husband ready for work. The house was noisy, alive, sometimes too much so. I dreamed of silence, and hadn't even imagined what it tasted like. Now it was thick, dense, like an old blanket you wrap yourself in, not from the cold, but from loneliness. My phone lay nearby, its screen dark, but I knew it would ring. It always does. And sure enough, less than 10 minutes had passed before it quietly vibrated, as if apologizing for the disturbance. I didn't pick it up right away. I gave myself a few seconds to breathe deeply. Mom. My daughter's voice was cheerful, too cheerful for early morning. We'll pick you up in an hour, okay? We'll quickly pack the kids and go. You don't mind, right? I was silent. This silence lasted only a few seconds, but for me it felt like an eternity. I looked at my hands. They had become thinner, the skin more translucent, the veins more visible. These hands had held her when she took her first steps. These hands had stroked her head when she cried. These hands were always there. Mom. A slight tremor crept into my voice. Are you there? I was there. And yet somewhere very far away. I suddenly realized that if I said the usual, of course, now, the day would follow a familiar pattern. Grandchildren, bags, rushing, noise, and then a week without sleep, without silence, without myself. I loved them, very much. But lately, love has become like a heavy bag that you carry because you're used to it, not because you can. My voice sounded quiet, almost alien. I'm tired. The words hung in the air. I'd never said it out loud before. As if I was afraid that if I said it, the tiredness would become real, tangible, irrevocable. Mom, come on. She laughed, but the laugh was strained. It's only for a week. The kids are waiting for you so much. I closed my eyes. I imagined their faces, their voices, their small hands. My heart sank, but at the same time, Something inside me quietly, almost imperceptibly, straightened my shoulders. I know, I said slowly, but today, I can't. There was silence on the other end of the line. This silence was different, not the morning silence, not the home silence. It was sharp, tense. Are you sick? She asked in a different tone.
No, y replía.
Just tired. The words came out calmly again, without excuses. I was surprised by this calm, as if it wasn't me speaking, but some new woman I didn't yet know. She said something, then fell silent, then sighed. I heard her cover the receiver with her hand, whispering something to her husband. Before, at moments like these, I'd start making excuses, hastily, haltingly, as if I'd done something wrong. But now I just sat and waited. Mom, she finally said, "You're letting us down so badly." These words always worked without fail. But not today. Today they swept through me like the wind through old curtains.
I'm sorry, he replied.
And it was true. I was sorry. But for the first time, pity didn't overcome me. The conversation ended quickly. The phone went out again. I put it on the table and sat without moving for a long time. The kettle boiled and turned off by itself, clicking like a period at the end of a sentence. I didn't know what would happen next. I only knew one thing. Something had changed inside me. An hour later, I heard voices in the yard. I went to the window. The car was parked at the entrance. The children were running around, laughing. I saw my daughter looking back at my windows. I didn't wave. I just stood and watched. My heart ached, but it didn't break. The pain was quiet, tolerable, like an old friend. When they left, the house became quiet again. But this silence was different. It wasn't empty. It was expectant. I walked through the rooms, slowly, touching the furniture, the photographs, the books. On one of the shelves sat a framed portrait of me, still young, with lively eyes. I stared at it for a long time and suddenly realized I wanted this woman back. Not all of her, no, at least part of her. I sat in a chair by the window, covered myself with a blanket, and closed my eyes. Outside, the day was breaking. People were hurrying, cars were humming, life was going on as usual. And I sat there, and for the first time in many years, I didn't feel obligated. It was scary. And at the same time, surprisingly warm. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if they would forgive me, if they would understand. But in that moment, in that silence, for the first time, I allowed myself to simply be. And that no, spoken quietly, without shouting, became the loudest word of my life. After their departure, the house remained restless for a long time, as if it had become accustomed to a different air and now didn't know how to exist without other people's footsteps and voices. I walked from room to room slowly, almost cautiously, as if afraid of disturbing something fragile that had barely emerged within me. This feeling had no name. It was like a warm light that turns on unexpectedly and at first seems too bright for tired eyes. I put the kettle back on, even though I wasn't particularly thirsty. I just needed to do something familiar, to make sure the world hadn't crumbled at my no. The water flowed softly, soothingly, and I caught myself listening to it the way I once listened to my children's breathing at night. Then I checked if everything was okay with them. Now I checked myself. The phone was silent. Usually, after such conversations, it took on a life of its own. Messages, calls, clarifications, requests, sometimes reproaches wrapped in concern. But now he lay quietly, and that quiet was more disturbing than any scream. I knew a pause doesn't mean consent. A pause means anticipation. I sat by the window and looked out into the yard for a long time. The bench by the entrance was empty. Women my age used to always sit there. We talked about the weather, about children, about illnesses. Everything was the same, always in a circle. Then one stopped coming out. Then another. Some moved in with their children, some to the silence forever. I still went out, but less and less. Words began to run out. That day, I didn't go out into the yard. I stayed home, and for the first time, I allowed myself not to explain it to anyone. I took out an old album. It lay at the bottom of the closet, wrapped in cloth, like something too personal. As I flipped through the pages, I felt time slowly recede, allowing me to see my former self. Here I am, young, laughing, holding my daughter in my arms. Here we are, the whole family at the table. There was my husband, still alive, looking into the camera with that special smile I remembered best. I closed the album and pressed it to my chest. My throat stung, but the tears didn't come. Apparently, they too were tired. Instead, a simple and unexpected thought emerged. When was the last time I did something just for myself? Not for my children, not for my grandchildren, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I couldn't remember. Towards evening, the phone finally rang. It wasn't my daughter. It was my son. His voice was always calmer, more reserved, and that made the conversation even more difficult. "Mom," he said after a short greeting. "What did you do?" I chuckled. The words, "What did you do?" sounded as if I'd started a fire or a scandal. But I'd just stayed home. "I didn't do anything," I replied quietly. "I just said I couldn't." "But that's not how it's done," he said, his voice irritated. "We're family." I knew this argument. It was always the last and most powerful. Family is like a seal that seals any objections. I remained silent, giving myself time. "I'm family," I finally said. "So am I."
He sighed.
I imagined him running his hand over his face, the way he always does when he's at a loss for words. "Do you understand what that looks like?" he asked. "I understand," I replied. And that was also true. After our conversation, I felt heavy, not from their words, but from seeing how hard it was for them to accept my refusal. It was as if I'd broken an unspoken agreement that my life had long since ceased to belong to them. I went to bed early, but sleep wouldn't come. Their voices, faces, and phrases swirled in my head. And yet, beneath the noise, there was something else. Quiet, insistent.
Mine.
That night, I woke up because the room was too quiet. Not in a frightening way, different. I sat up in bed and suddenly realized clearly, if I gave in now, I'd never be able to say no again. The thought was terrifying, but even more terrifying was the idea of living the rest of my life like this, lost in other people's expectations. Sometimes life brings small surprises. Link in the description. In the morning, I went to the store. A routine exit from the house suddenly became an event. I walked slowly, aware of every movement. Near the entrance, a neighbor stopped me. "Why didn't your kids bring anything today?" she asked with her usual curiosity. I looked at her and suddenly smiled. "They went on vacation," I said, "and I stayed." She raised her eyebrows in surprise, but I was already moving on. The words sounded easy, as if I wasn't making excuses, but simply sharing a fact. At the store, I bought fresh bread, apples, and a small bouquet of daisies.
I don't know why.
Just because. At home, I put them in a glass and watched them for a long time on the table, simple, lifelike. I felt warm. That evening, my daughter called again. Her voice was different, tired. Mom,
She said.
we'll find a way. Just don't be offended. I wasn't offended. I felt tired, but also a strange relief, as if a heavy knot inside me was slowly beginning to unravel. I'm not offended, I replied. I'm just learning to live differently. After this conversation, I sat by the window for a long time. Lights were coming on behind the glass. The day was fading. I thought about how many difficult conversations lay ahead, that I might be misunderstood, judged, even distanced. But somewhere deep inside, a certainty arose. If I don't choose myself now, there will be no one left to choose. I went to bed with this thought, and for the first time in a long time, my sleep was even and peaceful. It was as if someone inside me had finally stopped fighting and allowed itself to rest. By the third day, the silence no longer seemed new. It had settled in the house like dust on windowsills, becoming familiar, almost home. I caught myself no longer flinching at every ring of the phone or listening to the landing for footsteps. The house had adopted my rhythm, and I its. It was as if we had agreed not to rush each other. The morning began with a pain in my knee. It made itself felt suddenly, without warning, as I got out of bed. I sat back down, waited for it to pass, and suddenly thought, before, I would have already been running through my to-do list at this moment. Cook, meet, pick up, pack. Now the list was empty. And this emptiness wasn't frightening. It gave me space. I made some oatmeal and ate it slowly, unhurriedly. A light rain fell outside, gray and quiet, like my thoughts. I watched the raindrops trickle down the glass and suddenly remembered how, many years ago, my husband and I had sat like this in the kitchen on a rainy morning. He was reading the newspaper, I was slicing bread. We barely spoke, but we were happy. I caught myself smiling, and it wasn't a painful smile. That afternoon, I thought of an old friend. We hadn't seen each other for a long time. First, life got in the way, then my habit of not calling first. I held the phone in my hand for a long time, hesitating. And then I dialed. She answered almost immediately, as if she'd been waiting. "Are you alive?" she asked without preamble. "For now, yes," I replied, laughing quietly. We talked for a long time, about trivial matters, about health, about how quickly everything had gone. And then suddenly I told her about my refusal, about how I hadn't taken my grandchildren. There was a pause on the line. "Good girl," she said finally. "I never could." These words hurt me more than my children's reproaches. I realized there are many like me. We just rarely talk about it out loud. After the conversation, I felt uneasy. It was as if I'd opened a door to too many other people's stories, just like mine. I went out onto the balcony and breathed in the humid air. Children were playing below. Their laughter was loud and lively. I thought of my grandchildren. Boredom washed over me unexpectedly, heavily. I imagined them running along a strange beach, calling for me, unable to find me. My heart sank. I returned to the room and sat down in the chair. I needed to experience this feeling without running away. Before, I would have immediately called, offered help, changed my mind. Now I just sat. Boredom and guilt slowly receded, leaving behind a strange calm. I realized Love doesn't fade with distance. It becomes quieter, but deeper. Sometimes life brings small surprises. Link in the description. That evening, I received a message from my daughter. Short, emotionless. I read it and didn't reply right away. This was new for me, allowing myself a break. I lay down, covered myself with a blanket, and thought about how I'd lived without pauses for so many years, as if I was afraid that if I stopped, I'd no longer be needed. That night, I had a dream. I was walking down a long hallway, the doors on either side closed. A light was on at the end of the hallway. I walked toward it slowly, but surely. When I woke up, I realized that light was mine. In the morning, I responded to the message. Short, calm,
No excuses.
and for the first time, I felt no fear. I went to the park. I hadn't been there alone in a long time. The leaves crunched under my feet. The air was fresh. I sat on a bench and watched the people pass by, each with their own lives, and no one knew that a small but important revolution was taking place within me. A woman my age sat down next to me. We started talking about the weather, about pain, about grandchildren. She said she'd long dreamed of going somewhere alone, but hadn't dared. I looked at her and suddenly said, "Try it." She smiled, as if hearing permission. When I returned home, the phone rang again. It was my son. His voice was softer than before. "Mom," he said, "are you okay?" I answered honestly.
I'm stunned.
He said nothing, but there was no anger in that silence. Perhaps he, too, realized something. That evening, I sat by the window for a long time. The lights flickered behind the glass, and in their reflection, I saw my face. It was old, wrinkled,
Real.
and in that face, for the first time, I saw not only weariness, but also dignity. I didn't know how the story would end, but I knew there was no turning back. The last few days dragged on slowly, like an old melody in which each note lingers longer than expected. I stopped counting the hours and days, as if time had lost its power over me. It no longer urged me on, demanded me, or reminded me of other people's schedules. I lived within my own rhythm, careful but honest. Sometimes a feeling of guilt washed over me. It came without knocking, sat next to me, and remained silent. I didn't push it away. I knew it wouldn't be there for long. Guilt always appears when you live for others for a long time and then suddenly stop. It's not an evil feeling. It's just old. I noticed I'd started talking to myself. Quietly, almost in a whisper. I'd comment on simple things. The sun is out. Time to make tea. Take your time. Before, all the words had vanished, but now some stayed with me. There was something calming about it, almost homely. One day, I cleaned out my closet, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I carefully folded the old dresses I'd never wear again into bags. I kept a few, the ones I'd been happy in. I held the fabric in my hands and remembered who I was when I wore them. Not young, alive. And suddenly I realized I'm still alive. It's just that the world hasn't asked me about it in a long time. The phone rang less and less, and I didn't feel resentful. I felt a new distance gradually building between us, not cold, but respectful. Sometimes my daughter wrote briefly, dryly. Sometimes warmly. I accepted both. We were learning a new language of communication, one in which there were no demands, only choices. One morning, I received a photo. Grandchildren, tanned, laughing. They were holding shells and waving at the camera. Under the photo was a message, "Miss you." I stared at the screen for a long time. My heart sank again, but in a different way. Not as a wound, but as a reminder that love was still there. I replied, "Me too." And that was enough. That day, I went out into the courtyard. I sat on that same bench. Women my age were there again. They looked at me in surprise, as if I'd returned from a long journey. We talked. I told them I was alone. Some shook their heads, some sighed. But one of them said, "Sometimes it's good." And I smiled gratefully at her. That evening, I caught myself waiting for the call. Not anxiously, but calmly. It came. My daughter. Her voice was soft, tired. "Mom," she said, "I've been thinking a lot." I remained silent, giving her space. "I guess I've really gotten used to you always being available," she continued. "But you're human too." The words were quiet, but something inside me clicked, like a lock that hadn't been opened for a long time.
Thank you, I said.
And that was all I needed. After our conversation, I sat in the dark for a long time. I didn't want to turn on the light. It was easier to feel whole in the darkness. I thought about how my life was drawing to a close. It wasn't scary. Sunsets are beautiful too. The only important thing is that they feel like my own, not someone else's. I remembered how, in my youth, I'd been afraid of old age. It seemed like the end. But now I knew. Old age is honesty. It's the end of pretending, but the courage to be yourself. That night, I went out onto the balcony. The sky was clear. The stars were few and far between, but bright. I stood there, wrapped in a shawl, and suddenly felt grateful. For this house. For these years. For being able to say no and not lose myself. I didn't know what would happen next. Maybe the children will ask for help again. Maybe I'll agree again. But now it will be my choice. Not a duty. Not an obligation. A choice. I returned to my room and went to bed. Sleep came quickly. There was no anxiety in it. Only a warm light and the feeling that I had finally found my place in my own life. Time passed. I can't say exactly how much. The days no longer formed the usual weeks, and the weeks didn't require names. In old age, time loses its strictness. It becomes soft, like an old shawl you throw over your shoulders not for warmth, but for peace. I still wake up early, sometimes before dawn. I lie and listen to the house. It still breathes with me. Sometimes it creaks, sometimes it sighs, as if it, too, is tired of the years. We have become similar. I no longer rush to get up. I allow myself to lie there, recall a dream, if I had one, or simply think that the day is still ahead and it belongs to me. The children returned from their trip different. Not outwardly, but internally. You can feel it immediately, even in their voices. They became more careful in their words, more attentive in their pauses. The grandchildren came again. I waited for them. Truly. Not out of duty, not because it's customary, but because I wanted to. And when they made noise in the house, I wasn't as tired as before. Because I knew they weren't here forever. And neither was I. Sometimes I say yes. Sometimes, again, no. And neither of those words fill me with fear anymore. The fear has gone along with the feeling that my life belongs to someone else. I've realized something simple. Love doesn't require self-denial. It deepens when it has boundaries. I've started going out more often. Not far. Just for a walk. To sit on a bench. To look at people. I see myself in them, young, in a hurry, tired, confident that everything is still ahead. Sometimes I want to tell them something important, but I remain silent. Everyone has to find their own way. I have fewer friends, but our conversations are more honest. We no longer pretend to be cheerful. We talk about fears, about sleepless nights, about how hard it is to be needed and how scary it is to stop being needed. And suddenly it turns out that no longer being needed doesn't mean becoming unwanted. It means becoming free. Sometimes I think about the day I first said no. It wasn't loud. It wasn't heroic. No one applauded. The world didn't stop. But something inside me quietly snapped into place, like a vertebra that had been aching for a long time and then suddenly straightened. I no longer blame myself for being tired. Fatigue isn't weakness. It's the trace of a life lived. I didn't live it in vain. I loved. I gave. I was there. And now I have the right to be with myself for a little while. In the evenings, I like to sit by the window, watch the lights come on. Each light is someone's story. I don't know them, but I feel a kinship. We all find ourselves alone sometime. The only question is whether we know how to be kind to ourselves in that moment. Sometimes my grandchildren fall asleep in my arms. I stroke their heads and think about how the circle closes. I am once again close to the child's breath, but now, not dissolving in it. I exist.
Separate. Whole.
I don't know how much time I have left. Old age teaches me not to ask this question too often. But I know something else. The time I have left is mine. And in this time there is room for silence, words, pauses, memories, and new feelings. Sometimes I whisper to myself before bed, "You're doing great." And there is no pride in these words, only acceptance. And that, perhaps, is the warmest gift you can give yourself at the end of your life.